I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 25, Negotiation. November 18th, 2020, Washington, D.C., White House. Mr. President, it's a pretty straightforward funding bill. We're even throwing you a bone by funding nearly all of your top priorities and the rest of the government for the remainder of the fiscal year, said Congressman Tim Bork, the new Speaker of the House. Sachs grunted. You're trying to hold a gun to my head, Bork, and you know that. Bork leaned forward, an almost evil smile on his lips. If you don't sign this bill, then we will move forward with impeaching you over this whole state of martial law you're trying to impose on the country, he said. The president was unmoved. He crossed his arms and stared at Bork with a level of eye contact that would have made almost anyone uncomfortable. Perhaps you don't fully understand how martial law works, Mr. Speaker. But right now, I am the head of the government and the military. Congress's only role right now regarding our armed forces is to advise. You have no consent authority. You have no authority to threaten me with impeachment, and furthermore, you'd never get 17 Republican senators to go along with your little scheme. Bork turned beet red. You are not a dictator, an emperor that can just wield power as you see fit, he exclaimed. And you cannot come into this office and demand that I accept the results of an election that we both know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, was rigged by a foreign power. I have declassified the intelligence of this scheme, and I plan on fully releasing that information at the end of the day, so all of the American people can see exactly what's gone on. If your cronies don't accept the fact that a foreign power directly manipulated our election and support my efforts to hold a new, secure election, then I will have you all arrested for fomenting insurrection against the federal government. You can't do that, Bork shot back angrily. Oh, really? Asked Sachs. I have 21 governors telling me they aren't going to cooperate with the new election. As a matter of fact, all 21 governors have said come January 20th, they will not even recognize me as the lawful president. I am this close, he said as he moved his index finger and thumb to within an inch of each other, to declaring those states in open insurrection to the federal government and ordering their governors arrested and charged with treason. The president took a deep breath, changing his tone of voice. What I am seeking from you, Congressman, is either a budget for the remainder of the fiscal year or a 6-month CR to see us through this constitutional crisis your party has engineered. Bork shook his head in disgust. You think you're so powerful, do you? We're done here. He stood up and began a hasty exit. Before he could leave, Sachs shouted after him, You'd better watch what you say, Bork, or I'll have you brought up on charges of sedition and treason. He saw the congressman pause for a moment, but then he continued on. The two other Democratic congressional leaders who'd sat in on the meeting looked at each other in shock. Then, without saying anything, they shuffled out of the office as if they were holding their tails between their legs. The Republican lawmakers that remained sat there in a state of shock at what had transpired. The president walked around his desk to take a seat at his chair, while the remaining lawmakers and others stayed seated. He closed his eyes briefly as he lifted his head to the ceiling, taking in several deep breaths to calm his nerves. When Sachs opened his eyes again and looked at them, he had a burning fire in place of what was once uncertainty. He turned first to his chief of staff. "Rich, get me the AG. I want him to issue an ultimatum to these renegade governors and the Speaker of the House. They are either going to comply with the written orders of the federal government, or I am going to declare their states in open insurrection against the federal government. They will be arrested and charged with sedition and treason." The Senate Majority Leader stood up.
"Mr. President, I know you're angry, but I urge you to use some restraint right now. Things are tense, I know, but we can work through this. We have to calm things down," he implored.
The President shook his head. "You've seen the intelligence. You know what took place. Our Supreme Court justices were assassinated to place us in this exact situation. No, we've placated them long enough. The law and the Constitution are on my side. These renegade governors and members of Congress will either adhere to my authority under the Constitution or they will be brought to heel. We cannot allow this open insurrection to take root and spread. We have to stomp it out now." Sachs slapped his palm down on the desk for added emphasis. The Senate Majority Leader slumped back in his chair, looking deflated and defeated. He looked up at the others in the room.
"In my heart and mind, I know you're right. We have to stop this from spreading. I just fear we are igniting the first spark of a new civil war that will ravage this great nation."
Sacramento, California, Governor's Mansion. Specially made breakfast pastries, gourmet coffees, and other breakfast items were set out across the exquisitely set table in the formal dining room of the California Governor's Mansion. The delicious spread was the centerpiece of a meeting of all the Democratic governors and some of the political heavyweights of the party. They were there to discuss the president-elect's 100-day game plan for the country. Then they would confer their support for many of his cabinet picks and jockey for other, lesser political appointee positions that would need to be filled once he was sworn in. The laughter and banter were loud and joyous. Glasses of champagne were poured to go along with their breakfast. It was a time of celebration, of optimism, and high spirits. Governor Gary Lawson was enjoying a conversation with President-elect Marshall Tate, who was seated next to him. They talked about making California's environmental laws and standards the law of the land for the rest of the country, and how they would look to model the rest of the country around the progressive policies that had been remaking California into the green powerhouse it had become. They also gloated amongst themselves about the ultimatum the Speaker of the House was presenting to the President that morning. While the governors were collectively finishing their breakfast and jovial conversations, Jerome Powell silently walked up behind the President-elect and whispered something in his ear. Marshall jerked his head around hard with a stern look on his face.
"You've got to be kidding me. He can't be serious,"
Marshall retorted. Jerome solemnly nodded, then handed him a smartphone. "The Speaker of the House is on the line," he said. Marshall got up from his chair and walked over to one of the windows overlooking the garden outside. He listened intently, saying very little. After a moment, he hung up the line and put the phone in his pocket, but he continued staring out the window. Governor Lawson approached him cautiously. "Is everything all right, Mr. President-elect?" he asked. He turned to face Lawson.
"It will be. But I need to make an announcement to everyone,"
he said. He moved back to his seat, grabbed the sterling silver knife from his place setting, and gently tapped it a few times on the rim of his champagne glass. Governor Lawson noticed that the President-elect suddenly pulled back his shoulders, standing as tall as possible. "I do the same thing when I want to convey a position of strength," Lawson thought. The room quieted down, and Marshall cleared his throat.
"As you all know, this morning, the Speaker of the House went, with the rest of the congressional leaders,
to meet with President Sachs to discuss the federal budget, the last major piece of legislation Sachs should have to sign or oversee before he leaves office. Many of the governors nodded. No one had been happy when Congress had conveniently pushed through a continuing resolution to fund the government past the election rather than pass an actual budget. Congressman Bork presented Sachs with two choices. One was for him to accept the results of the election and begin the process of stepping down and handing the reins of power over to me. If he accepted this course of action, then the House would pass a new budget that included every final pet project Sachs wanted funded, including his blasted border wall. If he refused, then they were going to move forward with passing articles of impeachment in the House over his overreach of executive power by instituting martial law. This, of course, would take place once the House returned from the Thanksgiving break, so the President would have a little more than a week to think about it. Marshall held up a hand to forestall any questions. We all know that measure would never pass in the Senate, but it would send a message to him, and more importantly the American people and the rest of the world, that his reckless decree of martial law and his unwillingness to leave office didn't go unchallenged. Some applause broke out among the governors and the others who'd been invited to this private get-together. Marshall raised his hands again, doing his best to calm them down. With a more serious look on his face, he added, "As you may suspect, the President did not agree to Speaker Bork's terms. Furthermore, he told Speaker Bork to relay to us that if we don't cooperate with the feds with this redo of the election on January 4th, he will hold our state governments in a state of open insurrection against the federal government. He also said he will issue warrants for our arrests if we interfere in this process or do anything to impede the federal government from doing its job." Curse words and mumbling turned into a soft roar. Before Marshall could continue, the governor from Rhode Island interrupted. "Can he really do that? I mean, what does that mean if he declares my state in open insurrection against the federal government?" "It means he can order our arrests and dissolve our state government. He can assume a de facto control of your state," answered the governor of Nevada. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Slamming his hand down on the table so violently that it knocked a couple of glasses over, Governor Lawson shouted, "This is madness! He's not an emperor or dictator. He can't just threaten us with arrests for treason or demand that we adhere to his orders like this. Enough is enough. You have to do something." Everyone looked at Marshall.
"I think we need to seriously consider the possibility that we are going to have to forcefully remove Sachs from the White House. It's clear he's not going to accept the outcome of the election. With him declaring martial law, he can effectively turn the military loose on us, and there isn't a thing we can do about it."
"Forget that. I'm going to activate my National Guard force," shouted the governor of Oregon angrily. "I'm also going to order my state police and guard units to begin evicting all federal agents from my state." Holding a hand up as he stood, Governor Lawson asserted, "If we're going to do that, then I recommend we collectively try to organize this kind of effort, so it happens all at once. If we're going to stand up to this tyrant, then we need to do so together, in unison, or we're going to get isolated and arrested."
"I have another idea," Marshall said, obviously trying to regain control of the situation. "I'd like to place a call to the UN Secretary General. I've met with him on a couple of occasions, and over the years I've developed a bit of a friendship with him. Perhaps we can get the UN to issue some sort of declaration of support to our cause, and maybe that'll help get Sachs to back down. We don't want to see this whole effort blow up in our face, so I think we all need to tread carefully."
The rest of the meeting went by in a far less celebratory mood. The governors discussed how they'd work to secure their states from a federal takeover. and what possible legal actions they could take with the courts that might aid them as well. New York, New York, United Nations Headquarters. The first major snowstorm of the season was pummeling the city, blanketing the downtown with a fresh layer of snow. The large, fluffy cotton balls floated down in a torrent now that the sun had finally slipped below the horizon and the evening darkness had enveloped the city. Looking out the windows in his office, Secretary General Johann Baer almost didn't notice his smartphone vibrating on his desk. Snapping out of his trance, he reached over and grabbed the phone. "S.G. Baer speaking," he said with an air of confidence. "Mr. Secretary, it's good to hear your voice. I have a piece of urgent news I need to share with you." Baer recognized the voice of General Guy Mackenzie. His colleague's tone caused him to sit straighter in his chair. This must be important. "We have a meeting in 2 days. Couldn't it wait until then?" Baer asked. "No, it cannot," Mackenzie responded. Johann sighed. "Is it safe to say over the phone? You know how the Americans like to snoop on these sorts of things?" he asked, hoping that their encrypted phone was out of the reach of the NSA. A moment of silence ensued. "It's as secured as we can make it," the general finally said. "Maybe the NSA can crack it, but they won't be able to do it right away. What I have to tell you is important, and it can't wait." "Fine. What is it, Mackenzie?" "You know, we're almost 3 weeks into our training exercise with our new UN force. At this juncture, all the military units that are supposed to be participating in the exercise have already arrived and have been running through their specific roles. However, a convoy of Chinese-flagged ships just arrived at the global container terminal just outside of Vancouver earlier this morning. While this is a routine affair for large cargo-carrying shipping containers arriving from China, they usually don't show up carrying hundreds of armored vehicles and tanks." Johann raised an eyebrow at the comment, but said nothing. 6 of the ships that arrived in the harbor are vehicle-carrying transports. They were completely full of armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, and main battle tanks. In addition to the vehicle carriers, the shipping container ships are packed to the gills with munitions and supplies. Was there a new force arriving from China that's going to join us? Or did these guys just arrive a few weeks late to the party? Mackenzie asked. His tone indicated that he was not pleased with the situation. A slight smile crept across Johann's face. He knew what the Chinese were doing, and he was glad they appeared to be holding up their end of the bargain thus far. "General, thank you for bringing this to my attention," Baer responded. "I think I know what happened, and this is completely my fault. After the Chinese assigned a contingent of forces to your training exercise and our new UN standing army, they came back to me and said they would like to contribute a much larger force. In fact, they want to have a substantial force of theirs on a continual rotation basis. They feel this will help provide their forces with some real-world experience. President Chan also wants to use them to help improve China's image abroad as a humanitarian force. He told me his intent is to have a contingent of his armed forces assigned to the UN Standing Army for periods of 14 months, 2 months for training, and then 12 full months for deployments, wherever the UN decides to send them." Johann heard some heavy breathing on the other end, and it didn't sound pleasant. "Mr. Secretary, while I am appreciative of any member state wanting to contribute forces to this standing army, as the overall military commander of said force, I need to be kept informed of what units and nations are going to participate in it, and for how long. I can't properly train or develop a plan for how we are going to integrate this force if I don't know what forces I have to work with." Johann nodded, despite the fact that Mackenzie wouldn't see his response. "You're right, General. That was my fault for not informing you sooner. This decision by the Chinese president was made 8 days ago, and I must admit, I've been incredibly preoccupied with the situation going on in America. As you know, that renegade president of theirs has declared martial law. He's all but suspended their Congress, while he moves forward with a new election in January, one he says will be fair. Johann made air quotes around the word fair for himself. Fine. It's neither here nor there, Mackenzie retorted. What I need to know is how many Chinese forces are being assigned to my control, and what unit is in the harbor. I need to know where to place them in the training exercises we still have left to run through. For the moment, I haven't authorized their disembarking because I didn't know anything about it, and my own government has raised all sorts of alarm bells on this sudden group of Chinese soldiers and equipment suddenly showing up. We're lucky as heck the Americans haven't caught wind of it yet, or they might cross over into our waters and prevent them from unloading their equipment. The thought of the Americans moving in to stop that shipment caught Johann by surprise. He hadn't considered that. His shoulders shook involuntarily for a second. If I am not mistaken, the Chinese originally sent you parts of 2 mechanized infantry brigades and an aviation brigade. President Chen told me those units belong to the 39th Army Group. He went on ahead and sent the rest of the Army Group and will assign them to the UN for a duration of their 14-month tour. Once that term is met, they'll rotate another Army Group to the UN, so we'd have another fully functioning Army Group at all times. Mackenzie let out a whistle that did not transfer through the phone well. Johann held the receiver away from his ear for a second. Do you realize how many soldiers they just sent us? To be honest, Johann had no idea. He wasn't a military man. No, but I suppose you're about to tell me. At the beginning of this exercise, the Chinese had contributed 3,500 soldiers. Basically, it was elements of 2 different combat brigades, as you said earlier. They were going to compose a large part of the UN's actual combat fighting power. This new lot of equipment and soldiers, however, is going to swell that number to 45,000 soldiers. Obviously, that many troops aren't on the cargo ships. So do you know when or how they are going to arrive? I'm not sure, Bear admitted. I think the soldiers were supposed to be flown in via commercial flights. Mackenzie sighed again. I don't suppose the Chinese told you when they're supposed to arrive. This is another major thing that'll need to be coordinated with the Canadian government. I'm sorry, General. I appear to have really dropped the ball on this with you, and making sure the Canadian government was kept in the loop on this, Bear apologized. I'll find out and get back to you before the end of the day. My gut says they're probably going to arrange to fly into one of the Canadian Air Force bases, so as to not make a scene at the airports. In the meantime, can you work with the port on getting their equipment offloaded and sent to wherever you want them to send it for your exercise? Yes, I'll work on getting that taken care of, Mackenzie said, still obviously peeved. One other thing, sir. When we meet in a couple of days, we really need to talk about appointing an actual United Nations Minister of Defense. As much as I hate adding a layer of bureaucracy to anything, this is the type of coordination that really should be handled by someone with the expertise to do it and not be thrust blindly upon you. It's putting you in a bad position, and it's leaving me uninformed of what's going on at a time when you and I both need to be focused on our own individual tasks that lie ahead. Johann smiled at the suggestion. He hadn't even thought about that, but it made a ton of sense. He wrote a quick note to himself to start work on that right away. A short pause took place before the general added, What's going on with the Americans to the south of us? I'm reading a lot of unusual activity taking place down there with their government. Smiling at the chaos happening, Johann replied, Nothing we hadn't accounted for, General. All appears to be moving according to plan. Just make sure you get those additional Chinese forces integrated with your force and ready for a peacekeeping mission, should one be necessary. Also, before I go, I was told the Germans, French, and Russian governments were going to send additional fighter aircraft over to participate in your second training exercise. They said they were excited to be able to truly have some practical experience going up against some frontline Russian and Chinese aircraft, and the Russians and Chinese appear just as eager to go up against NATO planes. The two of them talked for a bit more before they ended their call. They had a face-to-face meeting scheduled in a couple of days, where they'd hash out some more details of how well the new UN force was working together and what changes needed to be made to make things run more efficiently. 2 days later. Johann stood up from behind his desk as he walked around to greet his newly arrived guest. With a broad smile, he said, "Welcome, Mr. President-elect. It is good to see you again. It's been too long, my old friend." The two of them shook hands and smiled as a photographer snapped a few photos of their official handshake. Once the formalities were done and the functionaries had left, the two of them moved over to a pair of comfortable couches in front of a large window that overlooked the city. The view revealed that a fresh layer of snow had fallen over the last couple of days, covering the city and the harbor in a beautiful, shimmering white blanket. Joining the Secretary-General and the President-elect were the newly appointed UN Minister of Defense, Manuel Philippi, General Mackenzie, the overall UN military commander, and 2 note-takers. On the U.S. side was Tate's chosen candidate to become Secretary of State, Robert Ross, a man who had been an Undersecretary of State during the Obama administration. Then there was retired Admiral David Hill, who would become Tate's Secretary of Defense, Paige Larson, who would become the National Security Advisor, and, of course, Jerome Powell, who would remain his Chief of Staff. In addition to Tate's crew, the Speaker of the House, Tim Bork, and Senate Minority Leader Isaac Rosenbaum were present as well. Noticeably absent from the meeting was the U.S. Ambassador, who hadn't been told about this private meeting. Tate leaned in.
"We have a bit of a problem right now, and we're wanting to know if it might be appropriate and helpful to involve the United Nations," he began.
Johann smiled and nodded. He could appreciate the delicate nature of the situation the President-elect had found himself in. "I agree, Mr. President-elect. This issue brewing in your country has caused a great deal of concern with many member nations of the UN. I've been contacted by numerous members, asking how they should respond to the latest rants from President Sachs. This declaration of martial law has a lot of people concerned about what is going on inside America," Johann explained. The American delegation nodded in affirmation.
"Sachs is out of control," asserted Speaker Bork. "In the last 2 days, he's threatened to arrest the governors of more than 20 states. He actually did arrest 32 of my own colleagues when they called for a vote of impeachment. Not coincidentally, these arrests have also removed my majority in the House to secure a successful vote of impeachment. Sachs' party is fully behind him, so I can't count on any of them splitting with their party to vote with me on this. Not to mention we'd need more than 15 of his members in the Senate to vote to remove him, and that is also unlikely to happen."
Leaning in, the newly appointed UN Minister of Defense, Manuel Philippi, asked,
"If you can't impeach him and your courts can't remove him, then why don't you wait out the rest of his term? He will officially leave office on January 20th of this next year, oui?"
Jerome sighed loudly. Technically, that is true. However, President Sachs has declared martial law. He has voided the results of the last election and is currently moving forward with his original order for a redo of the presidential election on January 4th. Right now, 22 of our 50 states are not going to comply with his order. That could change, of course, if Sachs follows through on his threat to declare those states in open insurrection against the federal government. If he does that, then he can take direct control of the state governments or appoint someone in the interim to run the state until he lifts his order for martial law. In that situation, I suspect those states will hold a redo of the presidential election. But who'll be able to say with certainty
that it'll be a free and fair election. He'll have soldiers guarding the polling stations and his own people overseeing the ballots for security purposes. It'll put a question mark on whether it was truly legitimate." Leaning back in his chair, Johann crossed his arms and looked at the ceiling for a moment before settling his gaze back to the people in front of him. "What exactly are you wanting from the UN?" he asked. Now it was Marshall's turn to lean in. He fixed Johann with his gaze.
"What we'd like is for the UN to issue some sort of statement condemning the Sachs administration's use of martial law as a blatant power grab, an attempt to stay in power. We'd like the UN to communicate that you support and validate the past election results showing that I won and am the president-elect. That come January 20th, the UN will recognize me as the legitimate president of the United States and not Sachs."
"What do you propose to do if and when Sachs ignores that statement?" asked General Mackenzie. He hasn't exactly been a big believer or follower of the UN during his time in office.
"If he doesn't comply with the UN request or our pleas that he peacefully leave office and hand over power, then we'd request a UN peacekeeping force to aid in a peaceful transition of American power from Sachs to myself,"
Marshall explained as he smugly sat back in his chair. For his part, Mackenzie ran his fingers through his hair, analyzing what Marshall had just said. Then he looked at Admiral Hill, a man he had served with in the past during his many deployments to Afghanistan.
"You know, a UN peacekeeping force in America would not be received well. As a matter of fact, we'd be viewed as invaders and most likely attacked."
"How do you propose we make this work?" Mackenzie asked.
Hill thought for a moment, then pulled out a legal pad, opening it and searching for some piece of information. "Right now, we are preparing to have more than a dozen states mobilize their National Guard units. Those units will be under the control of the state government until January 20th. Your actions would hopefully prevent Sachs from trying to federalize those units. Once President-elect Tate is sworn in, they will fall under his national control. If the Sachs administration has still not yielded power, then I will be making a plea to all active duty units and commanders to acknowledge President Tate as their commander-in-chief and not Sachs. I fully recognize that many units will not come over to our side, but the ones that do will bolster our National Guard forces. Even within the Guard, I suspect we'll have a high percentage of desertions, but the units that do remain will be our nucleus. Those units, plus your UN force, should be more than enough to convince Sachs to stand down and relinquish power. If he still won't leave office, then we'll look to move quickly and secure the major cities in the capital region with your help."
Pausing for a moment, Admiral Hill added,
"I firmly believe when Sachs or the units that feel like they are caught in the middle are faced with the choice of actually firing on their fellow Americans, they will see reason and yield. If they don't, then we need to be prepared to unleash holy hell on them and get them to submit quickly before we allow Sachs or his military cronies to mobilize their forces."
The military men talked for a little while longer, explaining the nuts and bolts of how this would all work out, discussing what UN forces were currently available and how they could be integrated with the U.S. forces on Tate's side. Everyone hoped it wouldn't come down to an actual military conflict, but if it did, it was Hill's hope that they could end it quickly and restore order to the country and its duly elected president, Marshall Tate. Chapter 26. Global Interference. Arlington, Virginia, Pentagon. Secretary of Defense Chuck McElroy read over the most recent intelligence summary of the newly created UN force carrying out its first training exercise. The more he read, the more he didn't like it. What in the world are they up to? he wondered. When he read the NRO report on the group of Chinese freighters in Manzanillo, he nearly blew a gasket. There was no logical reason for the Chinese sending an army group to Mexico. Why would the Mexican government allow the Chinese to offload such a large force in their territory? McElroy stood up and immediately headed down to find the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He needed another opinion on this. Something wasn't adding up. The SecDef burst into General Austin Peterson's office unannounced and walked over to the general, who was just finishing a phone call with someone. As Peterson placed the receiver down, McElroy shoved the latest summary from the National Reconnaissance Office in front of him. Peterson nodded. "I was just on the phone with the Defense Attaché office in Mexico City. He told me that yesterday he was informed by his counterparts in the Mexican military that they had opted at the last minute to participate in this UN training exercise. He said the Chinese were going to practice deploying a large force to a mock UN mission and would then go back home in a few months." It was clear to McElroy that these guys were up to something nefarious, but he wasn't sure exactly what. Something isn't right with this UN force up there in Canada. I understand the Canadians are big participants in the UN and all, but this is an awful lot of foreign troops all showing up in Canada for a 90-day training exercise. And now this sudden participation by Mexico and the appearance of Chinese soldiers on our southern border? The DIA just sent over a report last night that said 2 additional German air wings arrived at CFB Bagotville, while 3 Russian air wings arrived at CFB Cold Lake. What is going on up there in Canada, General? Since when did NATO members allow Russian and Chinese Air Force units to take up residence at their military installations?" demanded McElroy. "I wonder if it has something to do with this," said General Peterson. He plopped a 4-day-old newspaper down on the desk. It had been folded over to a story a few pages back and was accompanied by a picture of Senator Marshall Tate shaking hands with the UN Secretary-General Johann Baer during the senator's visit to New York earlier in the week. Suddenly it all made sense. McElroy had the most sickening feeling start to set in. He picked up the paper and quickly read through the article. "You don't think all of this is because of the senator, do you?" "I don't have enough information to make that assessment yet, but it does seem ironic that a massive UN training exercise just happened to be taking place in Canada right around the time of our presidential election. It's even more coincidental that all 3 of the nations being implicated in this foreign interference of our election also have substantial numbers of forces participating in this training exercise." "How big is that UN force right now?" asked McElroy. Furrowing his forehead, General Peterson looked for a report somewhere on his desk. After finding what he was looking for, he quickly scanned through it until he spotted the information he was seeking on the second page. "From what we've been told, there were 42 nations participating in the exercise. In all, the participating members sent roughly 68,000 soldiers to the exercise. However, if we factor in this new Chinese force, it probably brings their numbers closer to 100,000. Plus, they have a lot of their combat equipment and dozens of fighter wings present. So it's not just ground soldiers," Austin said, as he read from the int sum before him. The wheels began to spin inside McElroy's head, and he sat there for a moment, not saying anything. Then he looked up at Austin. "How did we manage to allow such a substantial multinational force to assemble so close to our border without us even participating in it to keep tabs on what they're doing?" Peterson snickered. "How many UN operations has the president let us participate in since he took office?" The SecDef shook his head. "Good point. Still, what are we going to do about it?" McElroy asked. "I mean, what if Senator Tate and company met with the UN leader to ask for his help? They have a freaking army of nearly 100,000 soldiers carrying out a training exercise in Canada, for crying out loud."
"I don't know, sir," General Peterson replied. "As long as they stayed in Canada and Mexico and don't look to be moving toward our border, I wouldn't be too concerned. That said, I think it might be wise for us to go ahead and put a few contingency plans in place in case we suddenly have to shift some forces around. I think our show of force with our fighters on Election Day put a real damper on whatever they were trying to do, because they haven't flown a single fighter within 50 miles of our border since then. They've mostly stayed way up north at their fighter training base at CFP Cold Lake, way out in the middle of nowhere."
The SecDef nodded. "You're probably right, General. I don't want to spook the president any more than he already is. Do you believe we should move the country back to DEFCON 5 or stay on 4?
They had already moved the country down a level 2 days after the election, once it was clear there were no further terrorist attacks. The increased defense setting had placed a lot of military units on alert and grounded civilian air travel for 48 hours. "Until we know for certain what's going on up there in Canada, I say we leave it at 4, Peterson directed. "We can come down to peacetime levels once everything with the election is finally sorted, and that force begins to head back to their member states. Speaking of elections, what are we going to do about the East and West Coasts? I've heard grumblings that the governors in Washington State, Oregon, New York, and a few other states are considering activating their National Guards to prevent Homeland Security from moving forward with the January 4th election."
McElroy sighed. The rumor mill had really started to run amok. "I've heard the same reports. I talked with Patty over at Homeland and Malcolm over at DOJ. They said some of the local FBI and Homeland offices in those states have been getting a lot of harassing calls from the public and some of the state government workers. Patty was telling me that she heard from some FBI agents that the California State Police might be ordered to remove them from the state. I have no idea how they believe they can do that, but I wouldn't put anything past Governor Lawson. The man believes California is the model for the rest of the country, so Lord only knows how far he'd be willing to push things."
"I'd like to see him force the issue at our bases," Peterson said, crossing his arms. "What's he going to do? Have the state police show up at Pendleton and tell the Marines to go somewhere else?" He shook his head. "I just don't see the point. Unless these guys are willing to start a shooting war, we're going to have a new election on January 4th. They need to be focused on turning out their voters and not trying to foster an insurrection."
While the two of them were talking, an aide walked in. "Excuse me, sirs," he said, clearly a little out of breath. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's apparently a big announcement being made in New York right now by Senator Tate and Congressman Bork that you should both hear."
The aide walked over, grabbed the TV remote, and changed the screen over to the press conference that was clearly well underway.
"President Sachs lost the election," Congressman Bork said. "Instead of accepting that loss, he has ginned up an elaborate excuse. 5 of the U.S. Circuit Courts have ruled that he lost, and that he does not have the constitutional authority to change the date and time of the election. Only Congress has that authority. Furthermore, when the president was given a lawful court order that he disagreed with, he declared martial law and suspended the court ruling through executive fiat. Just the other day, when I was meeting with President Sachs at the White House, he told me that if Congress and the state governments didn't get on board with his new election in January, he would declare those states in open insurrection against the federal government. He would issue arrest orders for sedition and treason to any governor who failed to adhere to his orders. Just yesterday, more than 30 congressional members of the Democratic caucus were arrested on charges of sedition and are even now being held in federal custody by the FBI because they moved to file a resolution to impeach the president." General Peterson shot McElroy a nervous glance. President Sachs, through martial law, has essentially made himself a dictator, Congressman Bork continued. An American emperor answerable to no one. That is not how our government is supposed to function. As the Speaker of the House, I will not stand for this. However, I am powerless to do anything about it, because under martial law, Congress only has the authority to advise, not consent to whatever it is the President does. It is with a heavy heart that I stand here today with our true President-elect, Senator Marshall Tate, and ask that the United Nations consider a motion to censure President Sachs and to demand that he relinquish power to President-elect Tate come January 20th. No one wants a conflict, but President Sachs is steering our country on that dangerous course. I call on all Americans to voice your concerns to your elected officials and demand President Sachs accept the results of the November election and recognize Senator Marshall Tate as our next president. Holy crap! He's going to start a civil war, McElroy muttered, more to himself than anyone else in the room.
I have a bad feeling about this UN force, Chuck, announced Peterson. I think we'd better start chopping some orders to get some forces moved around. We may need to deal with some of these governors. We'd also better work on getting these state National Guard units federalized ASAP. We need them reporting to us, not the governors.
I have to call the president, said McElroy. We need to get over to the White House and figure out what we're going to do. The two of them gathered up some of their notes and other items they thought they might need and headed over to the helipad. There wasn't time to wade through Washington traffic. They needed to get to the White House as fast as humanly possible. Washington, D.C., White House, Situation Room.
What the heck are they doing, Chuck? Demanded the president.
I think they're trying to box us into a corner, Mr. President, explained the SecDef. We either yield to their demands or they're going to push for a conflict. The FBI director quickly added,
I've been receiving calls from all the field offices in roughly 20 states. They are being told that they have 48 hours to vacate the state. All the agents and their families. If they don't, they're being told that they will be forcibly removed by the state police or local law enforcement.
Patty Hogan from Homeland chimed in. We've gotten the same calls. Our ICE, DEA, ATF, and other Homeland offices are being told the same information. It looks like they're going after all of the federal law enforcement agencies at once.
This is ludicrous, shouted Malcolm Wright, the Attorney General.
He slapped his hand on the table in frustration.
You need to declare these states in open insurrection and suspend the Posse Comitatus Act immediately. You also need to federalize their National Guard units. We can use them to put this insurrection down and arrest these treasonous bastards.
General Peterson held his hand up.
Let's take this one step at a time. Let's work on federalizing their guard units and getting them on our side first, before we look to suspend the PCA and try to bring in federal troops. Once we cross that Rubicon, there's no going back. We need to keep these guard units and the general population on our side, not theirs. The president nodded. Thank you for that, General. You're right, of course. Please move ahead with getting the guard units federalized, and we'll take it from there. I don't want this to spiral out of control or turn into an armed conflict. We all need to tread carefully here. A single incident could set things off in a direction none of us want to see. As to the UN, I want our ambassador to do what he can to block whatever resolution the UN tries to push through. Also, let them know that we're watching that UN training exercise closely. Remind them that invading America is not as easy as they may think.
I don't think anyone is talking about the UN invading America, McElroy stated cautiously. I think they're going to issue some sort of resolution condemning you, but I don't think they'd be foolish enough to think they can use that peacekeeping army they are training. Our little show of force with the Air Force a few weeks ago was a good reminder to them to not mess with us." The president sighed. He didn't want to admit that the SecDef was right, but he usually did a pretty good job of keeping his notorious temper in check. "Okay, everyone, you all have your orders," Sachs said. "Let's reconvene tomorrow with some updates and hope that somehow we can avert whatever crisis appears to be teeing up." Chapter 27. Ultimatum. Ottawa, Canada. Flanked by the Canadian PM, the President of France, the Chancellor of Germany, the President of the EU, and nearly a dozen other European leaders, Johann Baer stepped up to the microphone to make the most important speech of the 21st century. The crowd began to hush, and dozens of cameras flashed as he took to the podium. "People of the world, and more importantly, people of America, we must stand together in times of strife and adversity. We must continue to stand up for what we believe is right, even when what we believe is right is not popular. In the 1930s, the world stood by as a madman that, I might add, was duly elected by his people, came to power in Germany. Within a handful of years, he moved the country away from democracy and became a dictator. It is a sad part of my home nation's history, and it is something my country has been atoning for ever since." He paused for a moment. 4 years ago, America elected a man to office with no political experience to fix the ills of the nation and return it to its former greatness. That man has blamed America's ills on a myriad of nations and groups of people. He has withdrawn America from the treaties designed to save our planet from environmental catastrophe. That man has also diminished America's support and commitment to NATO, and largely withdrawn the United States military from Europe. Sachs has supported and praised the dictatorship regimes flourishing in the Middle East and in Asia. He has now moved to make himself an American dictator, a leader answerable to no one. Sachs lost his re-election, but rather than accept that loss, he has found a way to lay blame for that loss on China, Russia, and even my own home nation of Germany. Secretary General Baer shook his head. "No, my friends, we cannot allow this to happen. Not again. Not on our watch. In 1930s Germany, the world did not have the internet. We did not have social media to raise the alarm to what is taking place in Germany before it was too late. Now that we do, we cannot allow the same thing to happen again, less than 100 years later. The world can't be held hostage to the political choices of the 28% of Americans who vote in your primary elections. The world cannot be held hostage by your electoral college that disproportionately discounts the value of a vote in most populous states in your country by those in smaller states. The world can't afford to stand by and allow a dictator to take the reins of power in your country and control your nuclear arsenal. As the Secretary General of the United Nations, I call on everyday Americans to stand up to tyranny and know that the rest of the world stands with you. We support you." Johann paused as he looked to the other world leaders flanking him, before he returned his gaze back to the cameras. "Congressman Bork, the Speaker of the House, has expressed to me that he believes President Sachs is going to mobilize the National Guard and potentially suspend a law that prevents him from using federal soldiers on American soil to arrest his political opposition and imprison those who disagree with him. Because of this credible fear and threat of political reprisals, the Canadian government has offered President-elect Marshall Tate and his political supporters safe haven in Canada while they prepare to form their government, free from the threat of imprisonment by President Sachs. Furthermore, President-elect Tate has requested that if President Sachs does not relinquish power and leave office on January 20th, 2021, a coalition under the authority of the UN be sent to Washington, D.C. to forcefully remove him from office if need be. After consultation with many of the key contributing nations to our recently created permanent UN peacekeeping force, we have all agreed to support President-elect Tate's request. Even through the TV cameras, the gasps from the reporters in the crowd were audible. Bear ignored the reaction. Effective immediately, we are establishing a UN peacekeeping mission called Operation Restore Order, which will work with President-elect Tate to assume control of the U.S. government and restore order to the major cities and states within the country. I want to stress that this is a peacekeeping mission. This is not some UN invasion of America or an attempt by the UN to establish some sort of one-world government. This is a mission to restore order to America and return its government back to the people. The Prime Minister of Canada has offered to have his nation lead this force and has offered its ports and other facilities to the UN to be used as needed for this mission. I also spoke with the leaders of China and the European Union, who have said they will provide the funding necessary to support this peacekeeping mission and any expenses it may incur. He paused again. Had the world taken this kind of action in the 1930s, the world could have prevented a madman from taking control of Germany and leading the globe into the greatest conflict and loss of life of the 20th century. We cannot stand by and allow this to happen again. With that, I'm going to step aside and let President-elect Marshall Tate say a few things to his fellow countrymen. Senator Tate walked up to Johann with a grim look on his face, as the two of them shook hands briefly.
I will keep my comments brief, Tate began. I call upon President Sachs to free America from martial law and accept the results of the election. My fellow Americans, I call upon each and every one of you to rally behind me and support my effort to restore our country's democratic roots. Together, we can regain the freedom that makes the United States so great.
Washington, D.C., White House. President Sachs sat there in the Situation Room with his senior advisors as they watched the UN press briefing continue to unfold in stunned shock.
Turn it off. We've seen enough, barked the president to the person controlling the monitor.
Once the screen had been silenced, Sachs turned to his advisors.
What do we do now?
The Attorney General leaned forward. We have to act. Tate and those who are backing him have pushed for a conflict from the get-go. We have undeniable proof that the Chinese paid these postal workers to steal absentee and mail-in ballots. We have proof of Russian influence campaigns on social media throughout the election. We have proof that German intelligence, or at least factions within their government, provided the terrorists with the fake passports to gain entry into our country. Now, even despite having presented that proof in court to the American people and to Congress, we have people in both parties that will not accept it.
Sachs interrupted. That's not entirely true, Malcolm. Congresswoman Harriet Miller sided with us.
That's true. But then her party deposed her with the support of nearly 30 Republican congressmen, reported Malcolm. He shook his head in disgust. Something isn't right with this, Mr. President. There has to be more behind all of this, because there is no way this is all just happening in the last 3 or 4 months. This is a global coup to remove you from office and insert a candidate of someone else's choosing."
"I don't usually buy this conspiracy crap," General Peterson said. "But I also don't buy coincidences either. For nearly 2 years, the UN has been moving toward creating this permanent peacekeeping force. During that time, Canada has offered up their facilities to both train and house it. The Chinese, who've had a limited peacekeeping presence in the past, jumped all in when it was announced. Of all countries, the Russians jumped on board with this, and God only knows why nearly all our NATO allies, who used to perceive Russia as their most dangerous existential threat, have welcomed them with open arms. Then this newly created peacekeeping force just so happens to assemble for its first ever training exercise weeks before our presidential election. Now Mexico joins in at the last minute."
The AG looked like he was about to speak, but Peterson held up his hand.
"I'm not done yet. When we got hit with a terrorist attack, we traced the attackers back to the Balkans. We just happened to catch a lucky break and capture a Chinese citizen who broke and admitted he was working for the Ministry of State Security, and we linked him to the very terrorist groups that attacked us. Then, the countries that have always been friendly and cooperative with us suddenly turned on us when Germany, Russia, and China applied pressure on them. Somehow, we're supposed to believe all of this isn't a coincidence? No, the AG is right. Something is afoul, and someone or some group wants you, Mr. President, removed from office at all costs. I've been trying to do my best to stay on the sidelines, to not get involved in politics. But I'm not going to sit idly by and watch my nation be torn apart by a foreign power and then invaded by a UN peacekeeping army."
The president quickly pounced on his comment.
"What are you suggesting we do, General? I feel like no matter what decision I make at this point, there is no win. I don't want to see people hurt or killed, but what can we do to stop this madness from spiraling out of control?"
General Peterson took a deep breath in and slowly let it out.
"We prepare for war. We prepare to fight for our country and everything it stands for. Everyone in this room knows you're not a dictator. You've done everything you can to stop these terrorists and protect our nation. You've brought this conspiracy to the courts, to the American people, and to our political parties. You've been transparent in this process, yet forces beyond our control have continued to circumvent every attempt we've made at a peaceful resolution to this constitutional crisis. At this point, I believe that a conflict is exactly what this cabal has wanted from the beginning. A chance to invade our country with at least some support from our own people. I recommend that we issue our own ultimatum to the UN. We tell them that if they attempt to set foot on U.S. soil, they will be met with force. We also tell Canada that effective immediately, we are going to enforce a blockade of any additional military forces from Europe or Asia bound for Canada. We will not allow their nation, their facilities, to be a springboard from which to attack America."
Placing his hand on the general's arm, McElroy said, "General, you've provided some good counsel and advice, but this is a political decision that needs to be made by those of us appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate." General Peterson bowed slightly, as if ceding the floor to the others in the room.
"The SecDef is right," Sachs agreed. "This is a political decision that needs to be decided by us, not the military. I mean no disrespect when I say this, but I would like to clear the room and just have the AG, Homeland, FBI, and Secretaries of State and Defense stay behind. We have a lot to discuss. I'd like the rest of you to please excuse yourselves at this time. You can go up to the kitchen and grab some food or take a smoke break, but stay close. When we've decided what to do next, we'll call you all back in here so we can go over the decision."
The room cleared quickly, leaving just the president with his closest advisors. Patty Hogan spoke first. "The general's right. We have to move quickly on this. Things are going to spiral out of control quickly now. Hell, there's probably rioting already taking place in some of the cities."
"Chuck, you're the military man. What do you propose we do?" asked the president. "How do we handle this without creating a world war?"
McElroy grimaced. "General Peterson's right. I don't know how our intelligence agencies missed this, or how we didn't see this coming, but clearly there's been a concerted global scheme in place for some time to remove you from office. When everything else had failed and your support among the people stayed strong, this group moved forward with a more direct plan to get rid of you. Now that we know what their endgame is and how they plan to achieve it, we can move to squash it."
The FBI director interjected. "I've had to do an emergency evacuation of nearly 1,500 FBI agents and their families from 20 different states in the last 24 hours. Things are already getting out of control in the major cities, and this speech the UN leader and Senator Tate just gave is throwing gasoline on the fire. You need to deploy either the National Guard to regain control or send in the regular army."
How many of these National Guard units are going to be loyal to the federal government versus their home states, though? Asked Patty. I've already had a mutiny of over 1,000 federal law enforcement agents across a collection of agencies within the DHS that said they will not recognize me as the DHS secretary or you as president come January 20th.
The FBI director's mouth was agape. "When did this happen?" he asked nervously. "What did you tell them when they told you this?"
"First thing this morning," Patty replied. "It's why I think this whole thing is nothing more than a conspiracy to get rid of Sachs. As to what I did with them, I had them put on administrative leave while I worked to get them fired." She puffed her chest out a bit, proud of her decisive action. The president shook his head in dismay.
"Let's go ahead and get the National Guards mobilized, along with the reserves. If we're going to use the Guard, then we need to make sure we shift them around. We can't have Florida National Guard units patrolling or guarding facilities in Florida. I want them sent to different states and cities if we're going to use them in a civilian law enforcement capacity. Let's also do our best to make sure we keep the National Guard focused on law enforcement, while we keep the federal soldiers ready to deal with this UN force."
Sachs shifted in his seat.
"Chuck, talk to me about how we'd enforce a blockade of this UN force. My understanding is that some of these nations have naval ships participating in this exercise. What are we going to do if, say, the Germans or Chinese assign warships to protect troop transports or freighters trying to bring more soldiers and equipment to Canada?"
"We warn them to turn around and back off," McElroy responded matter-of-factly. "It's not like any of these nations' navies can really stand up to us in a shooting war. We have 11 carrier strike groups, plus our marine amphibious assault ships. If that wasn't enough, we have 50 attack submarines, another 4 guided missile subs, and 14 boomers. If we want to blockade Canada, there isn't a thing the rest of the world's navies can do to stop us. Saying all of that, though, I recommend we immediately pull our overseas forces back to the U.S., especially our forces stationed in Europe and Asia. If this turns ugly, we aren't going to be able to support or help any of our overseas bases should they get attacked, and I don't want any of our boys being trapped or forced into a bad situation, especially in Asia with China."
"You mean pull the remaining forces we have out of South Korea and Japan?"
Sachs asked skeptically. The SecDef nodded. "The South Koreans can take care of themselves, especially now that the North Korean situation has been handled. While the Japanese are not participating in this UN peacekeeping force, I don't want our forces there being targeted by the Chinese, or the Japanese being put in the situation where they'd have to intern our forces for fear of a Chinese attack."
Sachs shook his head. "It's practically December, Chuck.
How are we going to evacuate our people from Japan, Korea, and Europe before January 20th? We have a pretty big sea and airlift capability, Mr. President. As long as the Brits don't side with this nonsense, we'll be all right. We can use our bases there to help with the logistics in Europe. As to Asia, again, Japan isn't part of this UN charade, so we shouldn't have problems from the Japanese. The President caught the Secretary of State staring off into space, deep in her own thoughts. Haley, do you have any thoughts on how we should proceed? You've been rather quiet. She blushed. I'm sorry, Mr. President. I was stewing on what General Peterson said about all these coincidences happening, all conveniently around the time of our presidential election. Sir, these countries that we've linked to either terrorist attacks or the election interference all have a couple of things in common. What's that? Asked the AG. They've all either been targeted with sanctions by you or have been forced to accept new or revised trade deals that have cost them dearly, the Secretary of State explained. Prior to you becoming president, China had an annualized economic growth of 9% for nearly 15 years. In the last 4 years, that growth has been cut down to 4%. They've gone from having $635.4 billion a year in trade and a $375.6 billion trade surplus with the U.S. to $440 billion in trade and a surplus of $180 billion. They've lost hundreds of billions of dollars in trade with us, and it's hurt them economically. The technology sanction you imposed has also completely cut them out of the 5G market in the U.S., and that alone cost them probably close to $2 or $3 trillion in revenue over the next 10 years. I can see that angle with the Chinese, but where do the Germans, French, or Russians fit into this? Asked Patty. China, Russia, and France are all permanent members of the UN Security Council, Secretary of State Kegel explained. As to Germany, they essentially run the EU, well, them and France. Your trade policies have curtailed the EU significantly, and your withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord really turned the Europeans off. They really feel like you've doomed the world to an unstoppable climate disaster. Let's also not forget that Johann Baer was the German foreign minister before he became the UN Secretary General. Sachs leaned in. You really think all of this turmoil being created in our country is over money and trade? Retribution for me putting America's interest first instead of the world's? Secretary Kegel nodded. I do. I know that may be hard to accept, Mr. President, but you're not from the world of politics or intelligence. You've upset the global apple cart. These are powerful forces you've gone against. It's just money. They can always make more, Sachs shot back angrily. Kegel shook her head. It's not just about money, Mr. President. It's about power. It's about regime survival and shaping the future. Your energy policies are crushing the Russians. They're a petrol state, a one-resource economy that now has to compete against American shale and natural gas resources that they can't even imagine. In Germany and France, they are so heavily burdened by their nanny-state policies that your new trade deal with Britain after they left the EU really undercut their trade balances. The Germans have been supporting most of Europe for nearly 2 decades. That new trade deal you rammed down their throats is going to hurt them. Then there's China. All the Chinese care about is regime survival. They have over 1.6 billion people. That's 1.6 billion people that are consuming more resources than they can possibly grow or mine themselves. Then you factor in the trade deals that have laid off tens of millions of people, and the regime is facing the reality of massive protests and food riots. They can't survive another decade if you balance our trade deficit with them or cut them off from being able to steal our technology. She let out a sigh. I hate to say it, Mr. President, but yes, it is all about money, trade, and most importantly, power. Sachs stared at the ceiling for a moment. All I wanted to do was protect our people and give the little guy a fair shake, he thought.
Okay, let's assume that's what this is about, the president said. Who can we count on as allies right now?
Secretary Cagle leaned forward. Right now, I'd say no one. I think the UK is going to sit on the sidelines and see how this plays out. That's probably a good thing, because if the Labour government was in power, they'd probably be jumping on board with this UN peacekeeping nonsense. I'd like to say most of Eastern Europe is probably on our side, but they won't get involved militarily. They'll offer tacit support, but they'll look to stay out of it. The Middle East, that's going to become a mess. Unless the Israelis work something out with the Saudis and the Egyptians, they're going to be on their own. In Asia, Japan and South Korea will look to sit things out. Neither of those nations want to draw the ire of China, especially when they know they won't be able to rely on us to help them, because we'll be bogged down dealing with our own problems here. For the moment, Mr. President, I'd say we're on our own. The SecDef nodded. We need to focus on using the oceans to our advantage. While the UN force in Canada is a threat, we can isolate them with our Navy. Once we cut them off from their supply lines in Europe and Asia, we'll be able to pick them apart. I can't see this confrontation lasting more than a few weeks if we're forced to actually fight.
Okay, then. Let's bring the others back in and formulate a plan to get things rolling. If these turncoat allies want to play hardball, then let's show them what's what.
He turned to Secretary of State.
Haley, tomorrow, I want you to announce our withdrawal from NATO, as well as our withdrawal from the Five Eyes. I want everyone cut off from our shared intelligence apparatus. I also want the NSA completely turned loose on the rest of the world. I want to know what every government is saying, thinking, and planning to do to us.
He shifted to face the Secretary of Defense.
Chuck, order our Navy, air, and ground forces from around the world back home. Do it as quickly as possible, too. I don't want our guys to get stuck should these countries decide to play hardball with our withdrawal.
McElroy nodded and mumbled. This is going to create one heck of a power vacuum around the world.
Forget them. The world's been playing us long enough. We're bringing our forces home. If these UN turncoats decide they want to fight, then we'll give them a fight they won't soon forget.
Sachs slammed his fist on the table. The president looked at McElroy, the man who'd have to execute his orders. A wicked grin began to spread across his face. "Yes, Mr. President," he said. This has been Rigged, the Falling Empire series, Book 1. Written by James Rosone and Miranda Watson. Narrated by B.J. Harrison. Copyright 2019 by Frontline Publishing. Production copyright 2019 by Frontline Publishing.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.